moment the Marvel Cinematic Universe was truly born. Iron Man, a character few people outside of readers of Marvel Comics had heard of, forged a dynasty not with a boom, but with a ping scalpel precision to surgically correct his own cardiac arrest and heal the world. That ping is the sound of Marvel's Hephaestus hammering his new soul, and the sound that the studio would later play in the Avengers Endgame credits after Tony Stark's death. Yes, the ping, not the boom. It's a shot so good that they used it to close out the film's trailer. And we're allowed to cheer for Iron Man here because we previously saw him fall here, and here, and honestly, here, in Robert Downey Jr.'s public struggles with drugs in the previous decade. Something the actor hates to talk about, and you know what, for good reason. More than any other movie star, he earned his claim as Hollywood's redemptive hero. He brought authentic humility and penance to launch Hollywood's biggest franchise. So let's revisit it. I'm Erik Voss, and this is The Deep Dive, a channel that dives deep into the films we love to reveal new hidden details at the heart of them. And honestly, every single one of Tony Stark's falls in this movie are their own literal deep dives, and we need to deep dive into those falls. We are looking at summer game changers, and after Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, we have to look at the movie it shared summer 2008 with Jon Favreau and Kevin Feige's Dawn of the MCU, Iron Man, and how it changed everything with this one little ping. Also with an insane how it was made story that I don't think many of you really know about, and a frontman so flawlessly flawed that the success of every MCU story thereafter can really be measured by how Iron Man it is. And we'll talk about how Marvel Studios' current woes can really be attributed to its inability to apply the lessons of that first Iron Man film. So Tony Stark is very rich. Although it's nice to fantasize about having that much money, getting a little bit more here and there is very doable. For instance, I recently had amazing brisket at my local barbecue place for free. I used a Visa gift card that I got from answering surveys on Ipsos iSay. On Ipsos iSay, you can earn extra cash through gift cards and rewards just by taking part in research and answering some simple questions. There's a ton of different gift cards to choose from, but my favorite is the Visa because I can use it truly anywhere for anything that I want or have an impulse to buy. The surveys are quick, easy, and tailored to my interests, so it never gets boring. It's become part of my coffee routine to do a survey while I wait for my coffee to brew. It's that fast. I upgraded my downtime, and you can too. Just click the link in the description to start earning rewards with Ipsos iSay today. So Iron Man opens in the Kunar province in Afghanistan, and it's important to remember that Iron Man and The Dark Knight and Robert Downey Jr.'s other big summer 2008 release, Tropic Thunder, were all hitting America in the dog days of the War on Terror, as Hollywood shifted to a more cynical view of American imperialism and engaged in some elseworld wish-fulfilling thought experiments. The Dark Knight asked, what if we could find bin Laden with mass surveillance, but then dismantle that power immediately? Iron Man asked, what if we could kill just the terrorists in these places? Also, where are these weapons really coming from? And Tropic Thunder asked, are Hollywood elites really the right people to be asking these questions? But don't think too hard about that stuff yet, because Jon Favreau kicks things off in this movie with some classic rock. AC/DC's Back in Black would go on to be an anthem for Tony Stark, recalled in Spider-Man Far From Home. Favreau wanted to frame Tony Stark as a rock star who could blast this music in hostile territory, reminding us of the helicopter squadron trumpeting Ride of the Valkyries in Apocalypse Now. It didn't work out too well for them, and it doesn't work out too well for Tony here. This valley is not Afghanistan, of course. They shot this in Lone Pine in Inyo County, California, looking up at the Sierra Nevadas. And it's appropriate because Tony Stark does look at this place like it's his own turf. I just realized, though, Tony's first line in this movie.
I feel like you're driving me to a court-martial. This is crazy. What did I do?
So what did Tony do? He supplied his enemies with the weapons they'd use against him. He is a war profiteer, and it blows up in his face. This whole movie makes him pay for it. It really is his court-martial. The soldier asked Tony if he went 12 for 12 with last year's Maxim cover models.
Yes and no. March and I had a scheduling conflict, but fortunately the Christmas cover was twins.
And twins! Yeah, Tony's a prick, but you know what? We love him. This was Stan Lee's intention with designing the character all the way back in 1963. Stan Lee said in 2013, I think I gave myself a dare. It was the height of the Cold War. The readers, the young readers, if there was one thing they hated, it was war. It was the military. So I got a hero who represented that to the 100th degree. He was a weapons manufacturer. He was providing weapons for the army. He was rich. He was an industrialist. And I thought it'd be fun to take that kind of character that nobody would like, none of our readers would like, and shove them down their throats and make them like him. They do the same thing in 2008 with the War on Terror. And this smugness is something Robert Downey Jr., Jon Favreau, and Kevin Feige nail right away with the character.
Is it cool if I take a picture with you?
Yes, it's very cool.
In the upcoming book MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios by Joanna Robinson, Dave Gonzalez, and Gavin Edwards, a book that you should definitely pre-order by the way, I've read it, it's so good. We learn in this book that Kevin Feige surprisingly did not grow up a comic book nerd. He grew up really as a film and TV nerd, a lover of Star Trek and Richard Donner's Superman, and he got a job working for Donner's super successful producer wife Lauren Schuler Donner, who became executive producer of the X-Men movie in 2000, which has really got Kevin Feige started in the Marvel side of the business. But Kevin Feige, as a young assistant turned associate producer, tasked himself with reading a ton of comics. So he didn't find comics until he was in his 20s. Therefore, he had a film producer's discipline and not a sacred gatekeeper mindset. Feige knew that the recent Ultimates era of Marvel Comics was really where it was at, the era that embraced postmodern America. And with Iron Man, the MCU film universe reflected that grounded reality, at least in phase 1. Tony says,
Yeah, peace. I love peace. I'll be out of a job with peace.
Now he says it sarcastically, but Tony's quest for peace in our time is what forces him to get a new job in this life. When he gets rescued in the dunes later on, he flashes a peace sign, not ironically, but sincerely, as a transformed man. He also says not to post this to MySpace, 2008, and he echoes that fear of social media in Endgame.
If you find this recording, don't post it on social media. It's gonna be a real tearjerker.
Now their caravan gets hit with a warhead stamped with Stark Industries landing right next to Tony, something Wanda and Pietro Maximoff will experience in WandaVision, and that explosion sends shards of metal through his body armor. He has reached the point where his top-of-the-line armor is weaker than his weaponry. He needs a new suit to protect himself from himself. Tony wakes up in a cave in a ransom video with the 10 Rings banner behind him. Now we will get to know the true 10 Rings better in Shang-Chi later on in 2021, but the intent back in 2008 was to set up the Mandarin as Tony's main villain in the sequel. Really though, the villain of this movie is Tony's own ego, his past as a warmonger, which in the third act becomes embodied in Obadiah Stane as the past of Stark Industries and a hulked out form of the shell our hermit crab grew out of. So we cut to 36 hours earlier, and I've talked about my theory that all American movies are trying to either be The Wizard of Oz or Citizen Kane, and Iron Man is really Citizen Kane. It's a story of a billionaire who seems to die in the opening minutes, and then we spend the rest of the movie unpacking who he really is through the eyes of his business relationships, his lovers, and the press. That said, as a man of metal in search of a heart, you could also see this as the origin story of the Tin Man of Oz. At the Apogee Awards, a video biography tells Tony's history as the son of Howard Stark, showing Tony in Wired magazine and Popular Mechanics, and this interesting photo of a young Robert Downey Jr. with a young Bill Gates. They actually photoshopped over a real photo with Paul Allen, which is funny because it seems like Bill Gates kind of erased Paul Allen's legacy too. And it's interesting how they randomly added a few monitors stacked on the left and right side of frame. The cover of MIT Technology Review shows the young Robert Downey Jr. drawing a sketch of the robotic arm that will later become Downey, the robot that will save his life. The text article reports that Howard Stark worked on the team of engineers that helped deliver the atom bomb. Tony later tells the reporter that Howard worked on the Manhattan Project, and hey, we might have just gotten another new Rockstars theory video about how the eternal Festos might have given Tony Stark's papa the tech to bomb Hiroshima. Didn't see that in Oppenheimer. A newspaper reports Howard and Maria Stark's death in 1991, which of course is later shown in Civil War, and includes this quote from Obadiah Stane on the right corner. Now Obadiah Stane was in league with the 10 Rings. Who knows? He might have supported Hydra using the Winter Soldier to kill the corporate leader that was in his way. Terrence Howard plays James Rhodes, aka Rhodey, future war machine in this movie. Now coming into this movie, Terrence Howard was recently Oscar nominated for Hustle and Flow, and he was the highest paid member of this movie's cast. Reportedly, for Iron Man 2, he was offered a pretty severe pay cut of 50 to 80% according to Entertainment Weekly, and ended up getting recast with Don Cheadle. Just sounds like both sides might have been unhappy with Howard's experience on this film. Now when Tony's name is announced for the award, listen closely to the music. It's the 60s animated show Iron Man theme. We also hear this on the casino floor. And then later with Christine. And it's also Rhodey's ringtone for Tony. Obadiah Stane accepts the award on Tony's behalf, saying,
"Well, I'm not Tony Stark."
a truth that likely really eats away at Stane, which gets thrown back in his face later in one of my favorite exchanges of all time.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm not Tony Stark.
Tony gets confronted by reporter Christine Everhart, and she's described to Tony as cute by a swingers energy Jon Favreau, the director casting himself as Happy Hogan. Now, Kevin Feige had met Jon Favreau on the set of 2003's Daredevil when Favreau played Foggy Nelson to Ben Affleck's Matt Murdock. That same year, Jon Favreau released his surprise hit Elf, and yet it was still a pretty big gamble by Marvel to entrust Iron Man to him and to Robert Downey Jr. Robert Downey Jr. was still seen as Hollywood at the time as a redemptive figure for his various public legal issues with drug abuse in the 90s, but the real story of why this was a risk really has nothing to do with Favreau or Downey, because in the 90s, Marvel of course sold the film rights to its most popular characters, Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, to other studios, but after the 2003 Daredevil, Marvel execs suddenly got inspired to just take control of their characters and form their own studio. The rights to Iron Man had been all over the place, at Universal in 1990, then at Fox in 1996, Nicolas Cage had looked at this project, Tom Cruise looked at it. In 1999, Quentin Tarantino was approached to write and direct an Iron Man movie, but then Fox sold the rights to New Line, Joss Whedon was talked to about an Iron Man movie, but then the rights finally reverted to Marvel in 2005. And Marvel Studios bet big on Iron Man. They took out a loan from Merrill Lynch of $525 million, putting up other Marvel properties like Black Panther and Doctor Strange as collateral. So if Iron Man wasn't successful, Feige would have lost everything. The cast described this as a very stressful production as a result of this. There was a lot of improvised dialogue. Jeff Bridges called it a $200 million student film. Still, the gamble paid off. This movie made a worldwide gross of $585.8 million on just a $140 million budget, and it's why Favreau keeps coming back as Happy Hogan and essentially gotten a blank check from Disney to do whatever he wants in the Star Wars universe. And why did this work? We'll talk about it throughout this video, but really it just comes down to Jon Favreau understanding Tony Stark as a gearhead, a tinkerer, a risk taker, a Howard Hughes test pilot, a classic American hero, someone impulsive and flawed, but led by his heart. And that is what makes this movie work. Tony Stark in this movie is not in his sunny mansion living room kicking back. He's in his dull workshop working. He prefers the cave and the box of scraps. Now, back in Vegas, Christine Everhart is with Vanity Fair, but later in the MCU, she's a reporter for WHIH. The next morning, she wears the same red shirt Tony was wearing the night before, so she traveled all the way from Vegas to Malibu with him. Yeah, she was pretty committed to getting the story, but as Tony later quips to Rhodey,
I got caught doing a piece for Vanity Fair.
Christine activates Jarvis.
You are not authorized to access this area.
Jesus.
That's Jarvis. He runs the house.
That voice is Future Vision, Paul Bettany as Jarvis, just a rather very intelligent system. Tony named it after Edwin Jarvis, Howard Stark's butler, who was played by James Darcy in Agent Carter and made a cameo in Avengers Endgame. But Pepper's line makes it sound like she's correcting Christine by saying, no, it's not Jesus, it's Jarvis. And when Jarvis becomes Vision, yeah, he is very Jesus-like. Pepper Potts throws some shade here.
I do anything and everything that Mr. Stark requires, including occasionally taking out the trash.
The trash. I think this is another part of the MCU DNA, at least in the early years. It hates the media. Richard Donner's Superman, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, even Tim Burton's Batman, they all center around journalists trying to do the right thing. But the MCU, This universe is all engineers and soldiers and royals. I just kind of think after the War on Terror and the Jon Stewart effect on American society, 2008 America just didn't really trust the media. Pepper tells Tony about a Jackson Pollock painting, and he doesn't seem interested in it until Pepper says it's overpriced, which just shows that this guy's really playing with the fine art market and using it to flaunt his wealth. Pepper tells Tony,
The MIT commencement speech
is in June. Please don't harangue me about this stuff.
Another sign of Tony's growth later on in the MCU in Civil War, he proudly speaks at MIT and offers scholarships. Tony tinkers with his Ford Roadster, which kind of serves as an analog for his new armor. Like the look of the original arc reactor reflects the valves of the exposed Roadster engine, and it becomes a literal inspiration for his color scheme.
Throw a little hot rod red in there.
Now, on the plane, we see the Stark family crest, which is a double-headed eagle, historically an imperial sigil for an empire fighting wars on all fronts, never allowed to be at peace. But I also just noticed this shield has 3 stars at the top of it, just like the shape and the 3 stars of the original Captain America shield before Howard introduced the circular one. So Tony Stark grew up with a dad who worshipped Steve Rogers, and that's in his own family crest. Drunk Rhodey says,
When I'm putting on my uniform, you know what I recognize? I see in that mirror that every person that's got this uniform on got my back.
Rhodey is impressing on Tony the importance of team colors, a lesson Tony won't truly understand until he joins the Avengers. The music here is Ghostface Killa's We Celebrate. Ghostface Killa loves the Iron Man character and was gonna cameo in this movie as a Dubai tycoon, but the scene was removed. So Tony asks,
Is it better to be feared or respected? And I say, is it too much to ask for both?
now the common phrasing from the political theorist Machiavelli is it better to be feared or loved, but this warmonger without a heart doesn't know the meaning of love yet. Tony mentions proprietary repulsor technology, telling us that his Jericho missiles will provide the repulsors that he will later work into his suit, and he says,
I prefer the weapon you only have to fire once. That's how Dad did it. That's how America does it.
how Tony's dad did it was actually a weapon called Captain America, a weapon that was fired multiple times until Captain America was fired from the Avengers by Tony. And Tony ends with,
Find an excuse to let one of these off the chain, and I personally guarantee you the bad guys won't even want to come out of their caves.
The real bad guy in the cave of this movie is Tony Stark. He lets his weapons off the chain and he gets stuck in a cave. We get some shirtless Jeff Bridges, as Obadiah calls.
Obi, what are you doing up?
I couldn't sleep till I found out how it went. How'd it go?
Yeah, Obadiah was actually awake because he was nervous about his plan to get Tony attacked. Tony wakes up in the cave and his breath is visible here. Production designer J. Michael Riva actually added this after watching footage of a real Taliban fighter and saw how cold it is in these caves, and he decided to make the set super cold. So we meet Yinsen, who in Tony Stark's origin story in the comics is actually Vietnamese, but like the Mandarin, these are just kind of two depictions that the MCU steered away from. Yinsen saved Tony's life by removing shrapnel and installing an electromagnet powered by a car battery to keep the pieces of metal from reaching his heart. Yinsen says,
"We call them the Walking Dead because it takes about a week for the barbs to reach the vital organs."
What is this?
So Tony, from this point onward in his whole life, lives on borrowed time. From now until Avengers Endgame, he sees his mortality constantly. He senses that his death could be this week. He's a paranoid futurist worried that he will not have enough time to fix everything. Yinsen mentions meeting Tony at Bern, which is of course something that we see in the Iron Man 3 prologue, and they briefly drag Tony out of the cave into a camp where they've gathered all of his weapons, but the sunlight is initially blinding. Tony being in this cave is an example of Plato's allegory of the cave. The Greek philosopher Plato pondered that the unenlightened human was chained in a cave in such a way that he could only see the shadows on the cave wall, and he mistook those shadows as reality itself. Yet it is a job of the philosopher king to unchain society so that we see the light of true reality upon finally leaving the cave. And this is a process that Tony Stark takes himself through in this movie, from unenlightenment to enlightenment, from literally chained up in a cave to unchained and leaving the cave. And actually, while he's still in the cave, the first new light that Tony kindles in this cave is the ignition of the palladium ring inside of his miniaturized arc reactor that he made from rocks and scraps. Behind him, the lights flicker uncertainly, but that arc reactor hums and glows confidently. This is the eureka moment that reignites Tony's soul. Raza leads this faction of the Ten Rings, bent on domination of the Asian continent.
It allowed the great Genghis Khan to rule from the Pacific to the Ukraine.
A man with a dozen of these can rule all of Asia.
While at first he seems like a stereotypical 2000s vaguely Western Asian villain, he is being puppeted by a white Western industrialist, another Baldy in Obadiah Stane. And they do make it clear that this group actually speaks many different languages: Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, Russian, and Hungarian. Because the idea is they're not the Taliban, they're not Al-Qaeda, they're not terrorists in Afghanistan, they're the Ten Rings. So Tony hammers his armor together. And speaking of the Greeks before, he becomes Hephaestus, the Greek god of the forge. Hephaestus was actually pretty important to Plato because that ties in with Plato's myth of the three metals, in which humanity was born with some combination of gold or silver or bronze or iron. Gold for the philosopher kings, silver for the warriors, iron for the laborers. And before I mentioned the three types of heroes in MCU Phase 1. No journalists, but we got royals, we got soldiers, and engineers. Tony Stark, the Iron Man, despite his billions, really succeeds because he builds, he labors, he crafts. As Tony hammers, the fires of the forge are framed perfectly behind the armor. He is reforging his soul. It's an important image for anyone who has had to, out of necessity, hammer a new version of themselves in order to live and survive. The most powerful sound in this movie, not a boom, but a ping. We can't fathom a boom. It's too big. It deafens us. But we know what one strike of a hammer feels like. Tony and Yinsen activate this Mark I Iron Man suit, and the first terrorist to face this rage from the machine is a cameo by Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine. Nice. Since the lighting is dim, Tony's initial charge out of the cave really hits thanks to just really good sound mixing. Like notice here. Yeah, the clicking of the turns, the ping of the punch, which again is the same sound effect of the hammer. And ow, it really hurts. Similarly, when Tony gets his arm stuck in the rock, it's not the bang that causes the death, it's the ping of the bullet off of the helmet. Raza fires an RPG at Tony, but Tony dodges it and immediately fires a rocket back at him. This is the same move that Tony will do with the tank later when he liberates Gulmira. Tony finds Yinsen dying, and we learn the family he was gonna see when he gets out of here is, you know, the kind of family that he's literally dying to see. Tony torches his own weapons, feeling a certain satisfaction over that burning Stark Industries logo, and then launches out of the camp and crashes into a sand dune. We see this hermit crab already outgrowing his first shell, RIP Mark I. When he gets back to the States, Tony tells Happy to stop for cheeseburgers from Burger King.
Oh, burger, you had to have a burger. Yeah. Oh, come on. Did you get me one of those? There's only one left.
This is actually Tony's second hamburger in his hand, and after he eats it during the press conference, he pulls a third burger out of his pocket. So he lied to Obadiah, and he's right to not trust him. Now, this Burger King cheeseburger is hugely important to Robert Downey Jr. He said in an interview that in 2003, he was driving a car filled with tons of dope, he said, and decided to pull over for a burger. And he said, quote, "I have to thank Burger King. It was such a disgusting burger I ordered. I had that and this big soda, and I thought something really bad was going to happen." And Downey said that he tossed all of his drugs into the ocean and got clean. So a big thanks to whatever disgusting PCH Burger King Robert Downey Jr. stopped at, and the now heroin-addicted sea lions who took one for the team. Phil Coulson is revealed.
Miss Potts.
Yes.
Yeah, Favreau goes from this close-up of Pepper alone to a shot of Tony, and then Pepper in wide as Coulson is just hidden behind another guy's head. He comedically pops up from out of nowhere because, yeah, S.H.I.E.L.D. is everywhere and nowhere. Coulson is from the Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division, aka S.H.I.E.L.D., and we actually see its original yellow and black logo showing up later. Tony invites Obadiah and all the press to sit on the floor in an apparent kumbaya session, but really he does this so that he can rise up to the podium real quick and suddenly drop this truth bomb to catch Obi off guard.
And that is why, effective immediately, I am shutting down the weapons manufacturer division of Stark International.
An interesting detail here, the reporter behind the one who asked Tony what happened over there is Billie Eilish's father, Patrick O'Connell. Obi drops this nod to his comic book villain name.
We're a weapons manufacturer.
Obi, I don't want a body count to be our only legacy.
That's what we do.
That's it.
We're ironmongers. We make weapons.
Yes, this in-context approach to comic book nomenclature was also a big part of the MCU from the get-go. Characters are usually just referred to as their names, whereas their superhero names are for the public. This way, it personalizes these relationships as they're talking in non-action scenarios. So Tony wants to refocus on arc reactor technology, and Obadiah says they haven't had a breakthrough there in 30 years, and that it was something they just built to shut the hippies up. The first Iron Man movie is set in 2009, even though it came out in 2008, so 30 years prior to that would be 1979, which was the end of the détente period of the Cold War, which is when everyone was given peace a chance. That shifted when Ronald Reagan became president and resumed nuclear brinkmanship with the Soviet Union, and this would have been when Stark Industries likely would have surged in their arms deals, and Obadiah Stane would have surged at the company. You'll notice behind Tony in the scene is a tank of palladium hexafluoride. Palladium was the metal that he needed to form that ring to power his arc reactor, so we see how this large reactor is really being powered by the same material. Mad Money's Jim Cramer cameos with a segment about Stark's plummeting stock price. Another factor of the Ultimates comics influence is this idea that the MCU exists in our world, which led to things like the Elon Musk cameo in Iron Man 2. Iron Man 2, they really went crazy with the cameos. Stan Winston's studio did all the practical effects for this film, which is why they look so good, and that includes the designing of the Iron Man suit and the various evolving versions we see throughout this movie. But I think my favorite practical effect in this movie, and maybe one of the most important scenes of the movie, is this operation scene when Pepper replaces the arc reactor. Winston's team created the prosthetic chest with that hole, leaning it at an angle with Downey's real body under the chair as he sat on a stool. They framed it in such a way that you wouldn't see the bottom half of the chair. They used the overhead light to overexpose the fake chest to hide the line between the fake chest and Downey's real neck. And by doing this practically, it gives us some gross out body horror, like Gwyneth Paltrow's hand is really covered in goo there, and it reminds us viscerally that Tony Stark's heart condition really is at the heart of this story. Downey sells it with tension and discomfort, and it's the kind of thing that you just don't see in modern MCU titles where the body transformations are all VFX. And notice how Tony has Pepper do this, not a surgeon, and he refused to go to the hospital as Obadiah wanted him to because deep down he knows that someone in his orbit tried to assassinate him and he really only trusts Pepper.
I don't have anyone but you.
But really the most enjoyable part of this movie is this section when Tony is tinkering in his workshop. Favreau based Tony partly on eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes, and Favreau actually shot this stuff on the soundstage at the former Howard Hughes airport where Hughes built his Spruce Goose plane that proved wrong all the naysayers. And you can sense that same American can-do-itness and stubbornness in Downey's performance. And it's something that comes from his father, because earlier that shot of Tony with the 38 Roadster, there is a photo right next to him where he as a kid worked on this same car with his father Howard. So working with his hands like this is in his blood, as it is in our collective blood as Americans. But also in that DNA, even though Americans never like to admit it, is all the failures on the way to that success. Like this moment.
10% thrust capacity, chief lift.
Yes, the actual wire work and wall hit here were done by stunt performer Greg Fitzpatrick, but a number of other stunts were done by Robert Downey Jr. himself. This physical comedy and stunt work was another American tradition, something Downey honed while playing Charlie Chaplin in 1992's Chaplin. And you could see him channeling Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and all the old classic Hollywood greats in this performance. Downey knew it was the hits that those guys took that made them beloved to America. Tony finds Obadiah upstairs.
How'd it go?
Yeah, Yeah, the song Obadiah plays on the piano is a composition by Antonio Salieri, the envious colleague to the prodigy Mozart. And Salieri was rumored to have plotted to kill Mozart, just as the jealous Obadiah does to the prodigy Tony. Obi has brought back Ray's Pizza from New York. Jon Favreau loves Ray's Pizza and included a line in Elf about it.
There are like 30 Ray's Pizzas. They all claim to be the original, but the real one's on 11th.
Tony tests the boot and palm repulsors, and this whole sequence looks so good, but there's a hidden secret why and a specific choice Favreau made here, because Favreau had worked with wire work before, and he said that audiences can always tell when actors are dangling from wires on their back or from their hips, so his team found a specific way to suspend Robert Downey Jr. from the boots, so that it looks like those foot thrusters are what is actually propping him up, and we, as the viewer looking through the VFX, can totally see the difference in the weight. And another important MCU contribution here, the heads-up display. So Favreau shows Tony Stark placing the mask over the camera, and we cut smoothly from the eye holes to Robert Downey Jr.'s eyes, and boom, we get it. Whenever we see Downey's face in this kind of black void, we just instinctively understand this is just what Tony is under the helmet. It's something that we take for granted now, but it was something that this movie invented. Then we get this incredible hero shot of the Mark II armor assembling together, and the visuals here just hold up. Even though it's all VFX, we just saw Downey piecing together practical versions of these components, hurting himself with them. So psychologically as viewers, we just accept them as a real effect because we saw an actor touching and moving them moments earlier. So Tony takes off in the Mark II. Now on his way out the driveway, his heads-up display flashes a red indicator on the wall, warning him that he might scrape it, and that is the part of the wall that he scrapes on the way out. It happens so fast, but right away it assures the viewer that the heads-up display is as visually fun to look at and as attentive to details as the details of the exterior of the suit. So this is a movie you never want to blink during. Like for example, as Tony flies past the Santa Monica Pier, the heads-up display shows his speed in Mach units, Mach 0.04, meaning this guy intends to be flying at super high speeds, like you would have to in order to keep a metal suit suspended. Now Tony tries to break the flight record of the SR-71 Blackbird and his suit freezes over. This is a design flaw that he'll use against Obadiah later, and a feature that he'll install in future suits that he builds for himself and others. Tony ends his flight by falling through the piano that Obadiah was playing his evil Salieri song earlier. So far, both times Tony has had a cool flight in this movie, he ends it by completely wiping out with a crash landing. He's never allowed to get too confident. So Tony refines this suit into the Mark III armor with gold titanium alloy, mixing it with hot rod red from his Roadster, and after hearing this news report.
For Tony Stark's 3rd annual benefit for the Firefighters Family Fund.
Yes, a firefighter benefit. Tony sees himself as a firefighter, a first responder who rushes to hotspots and rescues victims, and the color red is his way of expressing that purpose. While Jarvis's interface displays Jarvis and Tony's conversation text on the screen, it doesn't register the news report on the TV, so even 14 years ago, this AI does a better job filtering out audio sources than Alexa or Siri do. Now at the benefit, Lee cameos.
Look great, Hef.
Yes, Stan Lee is not actually playing Hugh Hefner, he's credited as himself, and in an alternate version of the scene, Tony realizes his mistake and Stan responds. Tony gets distracted by Pepper and accidentally makes an appointment with Coulson for the 24th at 7 p.m., which is why Coulson later happens to be there at the perfect time to escort Pepper away from Obadiah. Pepper's blue dress actually might end up being Tony's design inspiration for her blue rescue armor in Avengers Endgame, because this is the moment he saw her in a different light, not just her beauty, but as the caring woman who framed his old arc reactor as proof he has a heart when everyone else thought he didn't. It's not just the rescue armor that he's conceived here, it's the name and the notion of rescue. Because Christine Everhart returns and shows Tony photos of Stark weapons in Golmira, which Tony remembers as Jensen's hometown. So Tony fires up his Mark III repulsor, and you can actually see the glowing energy moving from his chest reactor to his gauntlet. This is all coming from his heart. And every time we hear that repulsor warm-up sound effect, that heart-centric surge is what we are hearing. Tony suits up in the Mark III, and we cannot ignore the value of the garage setting here, because Tony's sports cars line the background and it gives Tony the appearance of like a NASCAR driver surrounded by a pit crew, all ratcheting everything all at once. When his chest plate is installed, the reactor glows like a car's headlight. So likening Iron Man with car culture is just the smartest decision of this film. It makes something that we couldn't possibly understand and might laugh at and turns it into something pretty much everyone gets. And of course, there's just great sound design in the sequence of the film. We get another ping here. Just the sound of that gives us the weight of this helmet piece. And notice the sound Tony makes as he strikes that superhero landing is literally the sound of the hammer from the cave. In general, the sound just tells the story here, as we go from screaming gunmen filling our ears to sudden silence. Yes, it's not these poor displaced refugees making all the noise, it's the men with the guns. And yeah, back to our opening clip, Tony does the confident, no look, walk off from the tank. But it's not just to be cool, even though it is very cool. His goal in this mission is to take out his Jericho missiles. He doesn't care if the tank explodes or not, his focus is on his own weapons. So Tony ends up in a dogfight with F-22 Raptors. The COAC calls the pilots Whiplash 1 and Whiplash 2, which along with Tony earlier joking Rhodey hooked up with someone named Ivan, probably nods to the future Iron Man villain Whiplash, Ivan Vanko. And Tony sets up display his current speed is Mach 0.57, but then he engages in supersonic flight, which would mean a minimum of 1.2 Mach. So just to accelerate to that instantly, Tony's body should be soup inside of that armor, just so we're all clear. Back in the workshop, you can see a version of Captain America's shield on the table behind Tony, a little Easter egg there. It's kind of sad to think that Tony was trying to build his own version of the shield that was carried by his dad's favorite hero. This whole movie really is very much about daddy issues. Pepper goes into the office to steal files about Obadiah's dealings, and the files include a whole bunch of Big Lebowski Easter eggs. On the invoice, the vessel is described as MSC Lebowski, and lower on that form is a mention of Credence tapes. This is a reference to when Lebowski filed the police report in The Big Lebowski.
Was there anything of value in the car?
Tape deck, some Credence tapes.
And then on the shipping manifest, beneath the barcode, you can see the dude. And then back to my favorite Jeff Bridges line.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
Yes, so this engineer is William Ginter-Riva, played by Peter Billingsley, Ralphie from Christmas Story, and producer on this film, longtime producing partner of Robert Downey Jr., and he would come back in Spider-Man Far From Home as part of Mysterio's team. So again, this movie just became so iconic for the studio that every part of it comes back again and again in the franchise. Obadiah paralyzes Tony with this horrifying high-frequency device. It's just terrifying to see the veins popping out of his skin, the flesh going pale, the ears bleeding. The camera tilts Dutch, and Obadiah says,
"This is your 9th symphony."
Yeah, Salieri coming back. In music, there is what's called the Curse of the Ninth, in which it's believed a composer's 9th symphony will be their last, and that a composer will die during or after writing it. And it's interesting to note that Tony Stark does eventually die in Avengers Endgame, which is Robert Downey Jr.'s 9th MCU film. But Dumb E helps Tony reach the original arc reactor that Pepper encased for him, meaning Pepper saved his life twice as a result of this operation scene, and so did Dumb E by leaving a cluttered workspace. Because had Dumb E cleaned up the workspace, he might have thrown that out. So to go rescue Pepper, Tony launches out of the same hole that he previously crashed through, past that old piano that Obi played on, mirroring Act 1 when Tony exited the cave that he was entombed in. This is a resurrection for the character. Rhodey looks back at the Mark II armor and says,
"Next time, baby."
I'm sorry, Terrence Howard. Hey, but at least you weren't revealed to be a Skrull for all the interesting parts of your life. Yeesh. Tony confronts Obadiah Stane in the Iron Monger rebuild of his Mark I armor from the cave. So Tony must destroy the old version of himself. Like the curse of his father with the Manhattan Project, Tony's recurring nightmare will be to fight versions and offshoots of the tech that he introduced into the world. They smash through a Roxxon truck, which is also on the building behind them, Roxxon being one of the Marvel energy conglomerates, and they're fighting on the Howard Stark Memorial Parkway, as this is a road that Tony Stark's father literally and metaphorically put him on. Tony defeats Obi by applying the lessons we saw him learn throughout the film, luring Obadiah into high altitude icing, blinding him with flares like he did the F-22s, dismantling Obadiah's armor like he did his Jericho missiles back in the cave. So all these plot points weren't just to get Tony Stark from A to B, they all come back in the final act of this movie. And it's one of the reasons it's the most satisfying Marvel movie to rewatch. Tony tries to repulse Ironmonger, forgetting his gauntlet is off. Yeah, you can hear an echo of Tony's voice there, because with this extra opening in the suit, his voice travels out from inside the suit and his helmet speaker relays his voice, so we hear two Tony voices. Ultimately, Tony's killing move is to talk Pepper through their operation exercise earlier, but with a giant arc reactor. This is a machine made by Howard Stark, not as an instrument of war, but as a non-nuclear clean energy device. Heart power from his father purges Stark Industries of its warmongering original sin. So Tony reads a newspaper with this photo of Iron Man, which actually looks like the leaked set photo that was taken of Iron Man a year before the film's release. So again, we see Marvel Studios' aversion to the media. It's kind of enemy number one to their secrecy protocol. And Tony proves the way the studio likes to handle the press by seizing control of the narrative.
Truth is, I am Iron Man.
Now, Robert Downey Jr. reportedly ad-libbed this line, which is crazy considering how important this moment would be to the MCU and to superhero cinema as a whole. Before this, superheroes were expected to have secret identities, but in the MCU, most of the superheroes' personal lives are public. Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, even Thor, public figures. And this is because in 2007-2008, the more recent Marvel comics like the Civil War event started to explore what would happen if superheroes had come out of the shadows. And I always love how in the shot, all the reporters jumped to their feet except Christine Everhart. She was the one who asked the question, because Tony essentially just shut her up by saying, you thought I didn't care about Gomira, but I was actually way ahead of you. And for Robert Downey Jr. as a public figure, having to deal with reporters shouting at him like this must have been a familiar trigger after his legal problems. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, most of America just saw a talented guy struggling to keep it together, and finally seeing him sober up for these Marvel films and take over Hollywood was such catharsis. And that's why I think it's so meaningful that Robert Downey Jr. looks directly into the camera when he says the line, because it's a signal to the viewer that we are in safe hands, that we're in for a ride. And there could be no better line to call back when Tony faces supposed inevitability in Avengers Endgame.
And I am Iron Man.
But back here in Iron Man, we cannot forget the post-credit scene, which was another critical formulaic element for the MCU that the MCU cemented as a genre trope. Samuel L. Jackson arrives as Nick Fury.
Mr. Stark, you become part of a bigger universe. You just don't know it yet.
Who the hell are you?
Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D. I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
Now, an alternate version of the scene would have featured Nick Fury referencing Spider-Man and the Hulk and the X-Men, but just having Sammy Jackson here as Nick Fury was a huge win for fans, because Jackson's face was used as a model for the Ultimates version of Nick Fury, after the character used to be white and had been played on screen by David Hasselhoff. But when in the comics we got a black Nick Fury, Samuel L. Jackson had said, hey, I'll be down to play the character, and they denied it, and bam, here he is. And it was so exciting. Now, Nick Fury was the hero of the most recent MCU title as of this taping, and it's just a sign of how far the MCU has veered off target in recent years. Nick Fury went from the mystery man with all the answers to a sort of emperor with no clothes. But rewatching this 2008 Iron Man film, the pathway for Marvel Studios to get back on track is clear. Give us an imperfect hero, take him down a dive, give us some clever practical effects that look amazing, make it fun, and instead of a third act boom, think of a precise ping or a repulsor warm-up sound effect that the hero can use to make their mark instead. That ping can be a web shooter, it can be a snikt, but it's gotta be small, it's gotta be unique, and it's gotta come from the heart. Thank you so much for joining me on this revisitation of Iron Man. I wanna know from you in the comments below, what makes Iron Man iconic for you? Please subscribe to the Deep Dive channel, and to all the channels in the New Rockstars Network, you can follow me at EA Voss, and to all my divers of the deep, next time, baby.